Are you looking for a book with tons of wisdom that really might shift the way you look at the world? Then this month's book therapy pick is for you. Hey everyone, my name is Diana Garcia. I'm a licensed mental health counselor and owner of a private practice called Nurturing Minds Counseling. If you're new around here, my monthly book therapy series is where I pick one mental health self-help book to review, recommend, and at least 3 highlights from the book just in case you never pick up the book. Let's jump into this month's pick. This month's book therapy pick is The 4 Agreements, as you can see from the screen, by Don Miguel Ruiz. I actually picked up this book years ago, honestly, but I don't know, timing is weird because when I tried to read it a couple years ago, I just couldn't get through the first couple of pages. It didn't really resonate with me, but I know so many people recommend it, people that I respect and trust and colleagues, so I figured, you know what, let me try again. For some reason, this time it was different. Again, maybe it was timing or where I'm at in my life now, but when I picked up this book and I started to go through it, I really started to get it and understand the concepts that he was trying to say in the book. So let's just start with like a really clear summary, as you can see. On the screen, the book is broken down into 7 chapters. And really, he's taking wisdom from what he calls the Toltec people. And so just to kind of give his definition of what they are, Toltec is not a nation or a race, but in fact, the Toltec were scientists and artists who formed a society to explore and conserve the spiritual knowledge and practices of the ancient ones. So really, as you can see just from the description of who the Toltecs are, this book has a lot of spiritual content and beliefs, and it kind of has that kind of philosophical feel as you read through. It's kind of similar, I would say, to The Art of Communication that I recommended a couple books ago. So if you like those types of book, then this might be up your alley. If you don't like kind of that more woo-woo spiritual content, then this might not be the book for you. But I will say, because I tend to kind of gravitate towards both, sometimes I do, sometimes I don't, and it really depends on how the author presents it. And then, of course, I always take everything with a grain of salt and really try to apply what I think works for my life and what's applicable. And clearly, if there's things that I don't really agree with, then I just leave that. So I encourage you to have that perspective as you read this book. Some of it, a lot of it is stories. And again, with a lot of spiritual books, if you've read different ones, you'll see that even how they explain the concepts at a time might feel a little abstract or confusing. I feel like he does give a lot of good examples, so you kind of understand the concept that he's going for. This month, I thought it'd be really helpful that I just go through the 4 agreements. I know that's 4 insights instead of 3, but just given the fact that that's pretty much the premise of the book, I thought it'd be helpful for me to just summarize how I understood the 4 agreements. Clearly, I still recommend that you read the book to understand maybe some of the history, the background, his voice, and much more kind of going in depth than I'm going to go in today's video. When we talk about agreements, again, it's helpful to understand that he's talking about that when we're born and brought up by our parents, society, or culture, that there's a lot of conditioning that we all receive. So there's a lot of beliefs that are in our mind that we don't even really recognize that they're true. I'm going to go with we don't really recognize when they're no longer helpful. So he really talks about these beliefs are really agreements that we were really taught through our lives, and that maybe when we were kids, we were innocent because we didn't understand them. But now as adults, we've bought into these beliefs that sometimes are holding us back. So he's talking about shifting and starting to create new agreements. And so these 4 basic agreements he talks about can really have an impact in your life. Agreement number 1, be impeccable with your words. So again, there is like a spiritual nature to this book. So he talks about that, like the poison of words or the power of words. And depending on how you use words in your life can go either way. So he uses it like, you know, when you say something cruel or harsh to someone, you put a spell, black magic. Again, you know, if that's not kind of what you like, just take that with a grain of salt. But ultimately, again, I think what he's saying is being conscious of what you say and what you put out into the world. Because at the end of the day, words have energy or can have an impact on other people. So really your role is to really be impeccable with your words. And I know that sounds super simple, but it's actually really hard. Because think about how often you say something when you're in a place of hurt or anger, just to hurt someone back, or you say things thoughtlessly without thinking. How often do parents say things to their kids? And again, he premises like the goal isn't to blame your parents because they're just doing the best they can. But it is helpful for you to start to take ownership of what you share and what you put out into the world. I found that it was funny because I read this book. I've been reading it in the last couple of days, and I thought, okay, so I kind of get and understand a lot of the concepts. But what is interesting, even in a conversation earlier today with my fiance, or yesterday, he was talking about something, and I was about to respond with, I don't know, something like sharp. And it's funny because I had just recently read this, and I really stopped myself, and I was like, but is that me being impeccable with my words? No, it wasn't being it wouldn't have been. So I actually didn't say what I was going to say because I realized that would have just been like, again, sharing something that really wasn't the intent. I wasn't trying to hurt or so forth. And again, it wasn't something that would have been really hurtful, but it wasn't me being impeccable with my words. So I think that it's just like the practice of taking these agreements and actually applying it to your life. All right, agreement number 2. Don't take anything personally. So clearly the first agreement was all about you focusing on what you put out into the world, the energy, right? The words that you're saying to others and how you're showing up. And so the second one, it's a little bit more about really kind of removing some of the power that other people can have over you, right? Over like the words that they use towards you can start to really shift if you start to kind of not take everything so personally. And there's a quote in here that I really liked. Personal importance, or taking things personally, is the maximum expression of selfishness because we make the assumption that everything is about me. I think we all do that. So I definitely want to normalize and acknowledge that. Like, how often are we kind of in our own heads focusing on our needs and like interpreting that everything is about us when the truth is that's not the case. And even if it is, again, shifting that and not taking it so personally so that it doesn't have such a huge impact in your life. And I think that's the piece that's really important that he's talking about, that a lot of times acknowledging that when someone does or says something to you that might be hurtful or uses words that are hurtful, acknowledging that a lot of times it isn't about you. It's about their own stuff that maybe they haven't worked through or aren't aware, right? Because again, with all these agreements, there has to be a level of self-awareness. And the reality is that maybe not other people have that, or maybe other people in your life just aren't really self-aware. So again, I think this is the piece, and like the more you can really start to acknowledge that when someone says something really hurtful, it's really more of a representation of them than of you. And then, of course, we're going to be in constant relationship with other people. But if you can start to really recognize when you are taking something really personally, and then, of course, you're still going to have a range of feelings. But once you can start to kind of acknowledge that and create a little bit more distance and realize like, okay, maybe it's not about me, then it's going to shift the way you show up. The third agreement, don't make assumptions. Again, this goes back to really being in relationship with others, or in general, really acknowledging how often you're making assumptions about other people's behaviors, how often you're really, and then this might go back to then assuming that everything is like personally taking something that's really not about you and making it about you, right? So how often those assumptions are getting in the way, and how to a certain degree, it's easier to make assumptions than to have the courage to ask and clarify, right? So instead of saying like, hey, did you really mean this? Or this is what you were really trying to do? That might take a little bit of vulnerability to say that or to ask, versus just assuming and then acting as if that assumption is true. Because that's the other piece, not even acknowledging when you're assuming something and then just taking that as truth. And I think the one piece too that he's talking about here, he gives an example like in a relationship, if you just assume that your partner is going to know what you need, and then when they don't meet that need because you haven't said it, then you feel kind of hurt and bothered. But really, if you just didn't assume and express what you needed, things could be much easier and different. And honestly, I actually do see that a lot. And I'm sure I've been guilty of it many times where I just assume that my partner will know, and then I get angry or hurt that he doesn't, right? Versus I could have just clarified that from the get-go. So again, this whole piece, and clearly all these agreements, it's really also noticing, right, what's showing up in your mind and like how many assumptions are going on when you're taking things personally. And he goes way more into depth about the mind and like descriptions and examples. But again, this whole piece is really being clear of the assumptions. And then of course that, and there's just other quote that when you ask or clarify for something, that everybody has the right to tell you no or yes, but you always have the right to ask, right? And I love that, right? Because I think how many times do we not ask or not question just because we don't want to, or we don't want to bother someone and so forth. So, the way to stop from making assumptions is to ask questions and being comfortable with that. Fourth agreement, Always do your best. I mean, again, that sounds so much easier said than done. And he talks about he's applying this to the 3 previous agreements. Like at the end of the day, you're going to make mistakes, you're going to mess up, but that's okay. He's talking about the only thing you can do is show up as your best. And that will look different every single day and every single situation, depending on your energy and just what's going on in your life. But if you can be honest with yourself, and when you look at your mirror in the mirror and say, did I do my best in that situation? Then that's all you can do, right? And so he talks about how in the mind, there's the judge and the victim and this book of laws. Again, read the book to learn more about that. But really, if when the judge starts to show up and, question whether you did something right or wrong, if you can sit in that seat of confidence and saying, but I did my best, then that should be enough. And again, he's applying these to the 3 previous agreements because, like I said, the acknowledgement that there's no sense of seeking perfection. You're human, you're going to mess up, but you can just get right back up and say, okay, I messed up, I acknowledge it, and keep going. And that's also doing your best. He also applies this to doing your best. And I really like this part because it's also kind of taking some of these agreements from just these nice concepts that we're thinking about and then actually applying them to action. So I do appreciate that he did really put an emphasis on, at the end of the day, your life is all about the actions that you do. So you can think about these things, they can sound pretty on paper, but at the end of the day, if you're not applying them in your life, then what's the point, right? But that also, again, doing your best and showing up to your life in that way. Let me know in the comments below, which agreement really resonated with you? 1, 2, 3, or 4? Which was the agreement that really kind of stood out? I'm trying to think for me, and honestly, I'm not sure. I mean, just maybe because I had the whole, be impeccable with your words. I already noticed myself applying it. That one really resonated for me, but also just do your best. Because again, if you can just do your best, that's all we really can ask of. So let me know in the comments below really which of these agreements really resonated with you. Some final thoughts on the book. I will say that there's certain concepts or sentences or the way it was presented that I don't fully agree with. But again, I think that's the same with all books. I do think overall there is so many nuggets of wisdom in this book. At the end, there's some prayers. So again, obviously this is a spiritual book. So just make sure that you go in knowing that. And if that's not your jam, that's totally cool. Steer clear from this month's pick. Monthly book therapy giveaway. So look in the comments below to see how to enter. If you are in the US, if you really want to read this book, then enter and see if you can potentially win a copy of the book. And lastly, I encourage you to continue nurturing your mind, body, and soul, whatever that looks like for you. Thanks, guys.